You're probably a critical race theorist. You don't have to be a lawyer. You don't have to be an advocate. You don't have to be an activist. You just have to be literate about the way that race works in this world. You don't want to help your children or other people understand how race might be working, then okay, you are an opponent to critical race theory. But if you think this is literacy, then you're on our side on this debate. You can resist those who try to infantilize you. You can resist those who tell you that your history is insignificant, your story is irrelevant, your aspirations are unrealizable. Our only choice is to show up, bend that arc of the moral universe towards justice.
Hello and welcome to Ways to Change the World. I'm Krishnan Guru-Murthy, and this is the podcast where we talk to extraordinary people about the big ideas in their lives and the events that have helped shape them. My guest today is simply one of the most influential thinkers in the world, whose work has given generations the language and framework to think about social justice and discrimination. Kimberlé Crenshaw is best known for being behind the term intersectionality, the recognition that race, gender, and class overlap to create unique forms of discrimination. And she is a founding figure in critical race theory, the argument that racism is structural. She has written a gripping memoir called Backtalker, including a fiery epilogue about the backlash against her life's work, the war on woke, and what it's really about. Kimberlé, welcome. Thank you very much for coming.
It's a pleasure to be here.
If you could change the world with one fell swoop, how would you change it?
That's a challenging question for me because I'm not one that believes in grand theories, but I will say this. I think that if the world had a lot less inequality, a lot less intergenerational exclusion, if we were able to think more critically about our past, we'd be in a better position to deal with some of the consequences today. So I, not surprisingly, believe that we could do a lot better with a lot more back-talking against those who say the world that we live is the only world that's actually possible. We can't change things. We can't disrupt the existing social order. I think if we could critically talk back against that, it would change the world significantly.
So why Backtalker?
Yeah.
And does it have the same connotations for you as it does for many people here, which is about impertinence, rudeness sometimes, arrogance,
challenging authority. Exactly. So I think the simplest way to frame it is when we are looking at a global move to authoritarianism, the response should be to challenge authority. So I try to take back talking as a way of reframing how we think about whether back talking is a good idea, as a way of reminding us that when we have authoritarians who are dictating how we should think and how we should move, we're basically being infantilized. So starting from that position of authority, telling us as citizens what's possible, how we move, how we should think, we should talk back against that. So that was why I called it Backtalking. It has a little bit of an autobiographical dimension to it as well.
You have a story very early on about a physical reaction of revulsion, of sickness to a discriminatory situation you're in.
Yeah.
Do you think we all innately understand right and wrong, discrimination, all of those things? Do you believe it is there?
I do think that it's there with respect to us as individuals. I think individuals have a sense of when they feel that they've been treated wrongly. Now, sometimes they're wrong about that, but I haven't met anyone yet who hasn't had some kind of moment when they're willing to say, that was unjust towards me. I think the challenge is being able to understand historical contours of injustice, understanding what happens when entire groups have been treated unfairly, understanding about how unfairness of the past continues to shape and throw a shadow over contemporary unfairness.
Can you tell our viewers and listeners about that instance?
Yeah, so it's an instance where I was invited to an all-male finishing club at Harvard University. And I was invited to this as one of 3 Black students in an all-Black study group. And our friend was the first Black person, or at least he told us he was the first Black person who was a member of this club and wanted to invite us as guests. My other friend, another black man, and I said, well, we don't know if we really want to be guests in this club, but we're going to go and we're not going to take any stuff, is what we said. So when we got there and we knocked on the door, our friend opened the door and stepped outside and didn't let us enter the club. We got ready to rumble because we thought this was the kind of indignity that we had both agreed we were not going to accept. And what our friend said to us was, relax, relax. It's not what you think. Namely, I'm not going to give you the business because you're black. But he did say, you have to go around to the back door. Kim has to go around to the back door because we don't allow women through the front door. Now, in my mind, this was precisely the kind of stuff that we had this sort of pact around. We agreed that we were going to support each other. But my friend thought that that pact only extended to ways in which we were excluded in the same way. If we were excluded because of our race, then the pact was on and it was good. If I was excluded because of another reason, I didn't gain entry into the club on the same basis that he did, then we had no mutual support pact. And I was shocked by it. I was angered by it, but I was also disciplined by it because I knew they didn't want me to make a scene. I didn't want to embarrass us as a group. So I ended up going around to the back door. And I started the book with that because that to me was a point of departure. I got sick that night from whatever I drank. And I think because I got sick and made my, deal with the universe like many people do when they get sick and they say, please, if the room just stops spinning, I'll never do this thing again. Well, the thing I was able to say at that moment is, I will never consume what I consumed this night, which was voluntary humiliation. I'm not going to do it, even if someone in my group is asking me to do it, even if the idea is that we as a people, whatever the we is, will be advanced if you take this sacrifice, you take this hit for the team. I get physically ill when I'm asked to engage in what I call asymmetrical solidarities. That was my sort of wake-up moment, and since that time, I've really spoken back against, or I've talked back against these expectations.
And of course, we didn't have the language of intersectionality.
We didn't, right?
When you were a young student,
right?
But that set you on the road.
That's right.
To that framework.
Exactly. And so, as I say throughout the book, I try to tell the story of intersectionality, my own relationship to intersectionality, not as a top-down, I was in my office somewhere and an epiphany came to me and I wrote it down, but as a bottom-up, experience-up, having these moments where there's something that happened that made me feel something. Sometimes it was, illness. Sometimes it was disappointment. Sometimes it was just hurt. Sometimes it was bewilderment or pain. I started collecting these moments and asking, what holds them together? What makes me think that there is a connection between the time I was a little girl and wanted to be the princess and the time that my friends wanted me to go around to the back door and other times over the course of my history? So tying those all together, there was a there, but the question was how to explain the there, and what kind of name to give that there-ness.
Yes, and you wanted to be the princess in the school play.
Yeah.
This story really chimed with me because I wanted to play Jesus in The Son of Man by Dennis Potter when I was at school. Right. And I wasn't chosen because Jesus had to be white.
Yes, right.
And you had the same thing.
Yeah, so it was this. I was in kindergarten, and there was this little sing-song thing that our teacher had us do, and I think it was a mashup of Cinderella, Snow White, Sleeping Beauty, all of the fairy tales that involve a beautiful, desirable, lovely little princess that everyone cares about and whose well-being is, important to the characters in the little story. And so I got to play kind of every role. So I was the mouse who scurried about. I was the horse who took the princess to meet the prince. I was everything. I was especially good at being the wicked witch. My teacher cast me in that role a lot of times. I thought that what I was doing, playing these roles with gusto.
I was cast as Pontius Pilate.
Okay, well, there you have it. Exactly. So you know this story, right? You know this story. So you keep thinking, I am showing my good nature. I'm showing how well I can throw myself into this role. Surely, eventually, my teacher will cast me as the princess. And as I got closer to the end of the school year, I started to panic because it looked like it might not happen. I was kind of worried that, is there a reason why I'm not getting cast here? But I said, my teacher likes me. She sees I'm really good. As we get to the last week and then the last day, I'm bugging her every hour, Miss B, are we going to do Thorn Rosa? That was the name of this character. And she would say, tomorrow, in an hour, the last hour, soon, we get to the last couple minutes of the whole school year, and I've not been Thorn Rosa, and I'm about to break. And I would say, please, are we going to do it? She says, yes. We started. They sing the song. Just as I'm about to enter, the bell rings. And so all of this deep anxiety and worry and maybe the hint that something was amiss, I didn't really match up with her view of what Thorn Rosa should look like, just came bubbling up. And, I'm crying. My brother comes over from the other side of the schoolyard asking, who is this Thorn Rosa? Where can I find her? Because he thought Thorn Rosa had beaten me up. And for me, it was a point of departure in a couple ways. My parents did end up calling my teacher to find out what went wrong. The teacher told them what had happened, and it eventually came to my home, promised that I'd be Thorn Rosa the next year. I knew there was no Thorn Rosa, possibility. I was not princess material. But it was a point of departure because of what my parents did. My parents didn't tell me, why are you crying about something so silly? There's so many other more important things in the world. They didn't say, well, who cares about being a princess? They understood for a little girl, being a princess is sort of a dream. Of course she would want that. And they didn't tell me that my feelings were overblown or illegitimate. What they did do was affirm that there had been some kind of an injury there. We might not have a name for it. It might not line up with all the other things that we as African Americans in the 60s were fighting in that moment, discrimination, exclusion from political power, but there was a there there. That affirmation that there was a there set me on a path of, okay, I should follow my feelings. I should interrogate them. I should question what's going on. And that, I think, is what allowed me eventually to say, there's a shadow that's being cast on little girls like me. We don't have a name for it yet, but there is something here that I eventually ended up naming intersectionality.
I mean, you obviously had an incredible upbringing. I mean, your parents must have been pretty special as well.
Yeah.
Because at a very, very young age, upon the death of Martin Luther King Jr., you stood up in church.
Yes. So my parents and my grandparents on both sides are what we call, in the African American community in the United States, race men and women of the 20th century. And what that meant was they were fully aware that there were barriers and obstacles that we were born into. In fact, even when I was born, I often say I was not born into a state of freedom because many of the laws that were passed in the 60s had not been passed when I was born. We didn't have equal right to employment. We didn't have equal rights to housing and to voting. All of these came in the middle of the civil rights movement as I was watching these things on television. And Martin Luther King was a very well-respected figure in that movement and also in my household. So when we got the phone call from my grandfather that Martin Luther King had been assassinated, it was the first time I saw my father just bend over in tears. I'd never seen that before. And so, of course, I listened and I paid attention and followed what the significance of this murder of someone that we didn't know personally, but were deeply invested in. It was clear that it was going to impact the forward momentum of the we. And we was very much a part of our family's understanding of who we were historically and where our interests were thought to be. So the next day when we were in school, and I think I was in third grade, the local activists brought us all into a church to help us process our feelings about Martin Luther King's assassination. We were like from kindergarten to high school. And they asked, well, does anyone have anything to say? And I looked around and was waiting for the older kids to say something. And it just became so painful, not just that Martin Luther King had been assassinated, but that his martyrdom did not create any words. There was nothing to say to it. And to me, it's one thing that the attempt to arrest our movement happened through a murder. It was worse to acquiesce to it and not have anything to say to it. So I don't know. I jumped up. I didn't have anything to say. I didn't know what I was going to say. But it felt important to fill that space with something. And so, little ideas came to me. The only public speaking I'd ever done was Easter poems. I didn't have anything to say. And at some point, something came out. I think it must have been what I heard my parents say, maybe something on the radio, but something to the effect that we have to walk in his footsteps. We can't allow this to turn us around. So I gave a little third grader speech about the importance of Martin Luther King and sat down, and then the nerves showed up. I was like, what was I thinking? But I do have to say it was an important moment because we didn't have Twitter back then. We didn't have social media. We just had the telephone. So somebody must have called my parents as I was walking home to tell them what had happened. And when I got home, my father's eyes were still puffy, but he was proud of me and lifted me up and squeezed me real tight. And it was exactly the kind of affirmation that one gets from one's parents about the importance of speaking back to the world in which we had been born into.
I mean, finding the words is clearly the theme of your life.
Yeah.
Why do you think you've been so gripped with this need to find the language and to define terms?
Yeah. I've said that I don't know if I find these words to talk back because of anything inherent in me or because of the family I was born into or the period of time that I was born into when millions of people were talking back, not just in my country, but all around the world. People were talking back to the logics of colonialism and imperialism and genocide and white supremacy. And so there was a spirit of talking back that was not just in politics, but it was in culture. It was in music. My family was a family made up of musicians. So music was always part of our self-understanding. And a lot of the music was carrying this message of talking back. I remember when one of the most consequential songs came out was James Brown. It was Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud. That was hugely significant because just prior to that moment where culture lifted this shift, the idea that you would call yourself Black was not a good idea. And then after the song, people were proud to be Black.
Because you were colored.
Because we were colored or we're still Negroes. So shifting from colored and Negro to Black, and Black being a source of pride, not something to apologize for, something that underwrote our expectations that things were going to get better and we were going to be in a better position, and we were preparing ourselves for that moment when society would finally open itself up. This was all part of the ethos of the moment.
But how much do you think the lack of words and the lack of language was part of the instruments of oppression?
Well, so I will say that moment I was just talking about, the movement from colored to black, was a moment that presented to me the recognition that what we call ourselves, the words, actually are meaningful. They carry a political, they carry a cultural, a social meaning that allows you to help shift your reality. So I think words became significant having lived through that, but also words were significant because my parents required us to come to the dinner table with something to say. We lived life not just to have life happen to us, but for us to think about, to engage, to have something to say about the things that happen. So trying to search for the words to explain what happened was something that I had to do from the time I was a kid. My friends used to kind of tease me because we'd be playing and, I'd say, oh, shoot, it's about dinner time. I've got to stop because I've got to sit here and think about how do I put into words what I've been feeling or what I've been seeing or what my experience of the day was. So it goes way, way back to my earliest moments of having to kind of do homework for dinner.
And that is why I guess there are lots of people who now want to put those words back in a box or erase them altogether.
Yeah, well,
because they have power.
And that's one of the most important things that I had to learn just in sitting through and watching words and concepts that I had come up with to provide a prism to see things better that judges didn't see well, that some of our allies didn't see well, in order to better advance what I thought was sort of a common agreed upon imperative to create more equality and create conditions of less injustice. So to watch these ideas be redefined, I even say regentrified, because the community interests that were packed into these words has been cleared out. And opposing ideas have been placed into these words. Of course, it's been disappointing, but it also just made me double down to say, you don't get to just redefine something or put words in the mouths of people who've articulated things that counter the whole purpose of why they were doing it. So the idea of the memoir, as opposed to a political tract or a treatise with all the cases on intersectionality and all the uses of intersectionality all over the world to push back against those who say intersectionality is no longer meaningful or useful. Rather than doing that, I wanted to tell a story about where the word came from ground up, not from office down. So my response to those who try to unravel it is to say, here are the experiences out of which these ideas have come. You can contest the ideas, but you can't create a whole narrative about where these ideas came from that aren't true to at least my understanding of my own story.
So can we then go to critical race theory?
Sure.
And where the stories are from your own life? Because again, critical race theory is something that is now defined by the other side.
Yes.
As something they want to erase, as something that is riven with hate, and is oppressive in itself. What is critical race theory in simple terms?
Yeah. Well, critical race theory is basically the idea that racial inequality and other forms of inequality are often embedded in systems that appear to be colorblind and neutral. But to the extent that they reproduce disadvantages, marginalizations, discriminations from the past, they still do racial work. They still help create and produce racially disparate outcomes. These are not just their features of our institutions. They're not things that are natural. They are things that have been created. And once they're created, their ability to continue to do the same things that they used to do is often uninterrupted. So we need to think critically about the stories that we're told about why certain groups are not in one profession and are located or ghettoized in another one. We have to think critically about why the stories that we tell about our relative nations are stories that are celebratory and don't often tell the full truth. about how we have wound up where we are. So critical race theory started with looking at law, what law was missing, what law was doing, how law was reproducing certain inequalities that it created. And then it moved outside of law as people started thinking, well, it's not just law that creates race. We understand that other institutions, other practices, even things like the market, produces things that we have associated with racialized groups and racial inequality. And it's because it helps people think critically. It's because it helps people ask questions or talk back to people who say, it is what it is, and there's no changing it because God created it that way. It's because it helps people criticize those ideas that it's been attacked. One of my mentors always says that if something is moving, if it's a vehicle, then those who oppose where it's going are going to try to describe it in a negative way. They're going to try to take it away. So what I've tried to do with critical race theory, number one, is show many people that the way they think about their lives actually counts as critical race theory. If they reject the idea that colorblindness actually describes the world, if they reject the idea that history has nothing to do with this contemporary moment, if they're able to read situations and say, I see race at work there, or I see gender at work there, they are actually thinking critically about the status quo. They're thinking critically about how we've arrived here. That's why people want to attack it and distort it.
So just explain why, so many people really struggle with the idea, I think, that there's something wrong with colorblindness, because it seems like, naturally the most innately fair thing to be.
Yeah.
Why isn't it?
Let me give you an example that actually comes from the memoir that happened between my brother and me, and then I think people might understand it in a broader context. I told a story about how my father had this rule that if either my brother or me came to him to complain about the other one mistreating the other, we would both get punished. Now, my brother was 8 years older than me. He came into this system with advantages that came from the fact that he was a boy, he was bigger, and he was older. What that, let's say, age-neutral rule did was privilege him over me. It meant that he could harass me, bully me, knowing that he had the power to do it, because the rule meant that we would both get punished if I went to complain about it. And it was only when I realized that the way the rule was working, I was always going to get punished one way or the other, either by my brother or by my father. But the only way that the condition on the ground, as it were, would change is if I went and told my father and took a risk that we both get punished. Now, to my parents, it was an epiphany when I showed up and said, you know what? I know I might get punished for this, but it's unfair that my brother gets to bully me and you're not going to do anything about it. This rule is asymmetrical. It does not work. That was an epiphany for me because, number one, it showed me that sometimes when you challenge unfair power relations, you will take a risk that you might get punished by your protest. But it's also the case that you are trying to shift the relationship and you're trying to show that what looks like a neutral rule is not operating in a neutral way at all because people are not always similarly situated. Now, take that to race. There are often times when, and I was a law student, when the dean of the law school told me that the reason why we didn't have many women and many faculty of color was that they just weren't qualified based on the neutral rules. Well, when we started looking at the rules, they weren't so neutral at all. They were rules that basically said you're qualified if you went to Harvard. Well, there was a period of time where women weren't admitted at all to Harvard, and very, very few people of color were admitted at all. So it meant that a facially neutral rule, we don't ask what your race or your gender is, actually ended up being discriminatory because it was based on a a backdrop that was never race or gender neutral. So you just build a policy on top of inequalities that everybody knew existed. That's not functionally equal, even though it is colorblind or gender blind. And I'll fast forward and just say in our country right now, we are dealing in a situation where the Supreme Court has just struck down a major law that was designed to protect Black and brown voters against discrimination. That law took race into account because race had often been used to diminish access to the ballot, to diminish the power that groups and communities had to elect someone of their choice. And many times these rules were supposedly colorblind. Even in the 19th century, when our government, state governments, used the grandfather clause to disenfranchise African Americans, it was colorblind. It was a colorblind rule, but it was explicitly an effort to suppress Black voting because at the time, the grandfather clause basically said you could vote if your grandfather would vote. What was done at a time when the grandfathers of most Black people were enslaved people and they couldn't vote. So there you have another example of a rule that looks like it's colorblind. It looks like it's symmetrical. But because of history, because of the context, it's not race neutral at all. It's designed to do exactly what it did, which was disenfranchise millions of African Americans.
So what is the answer to those people who, who dismiss critical race theory, partly because of the myths that have been created around it? Mm-hmm. You know, that critical race theory means all white people are racist by virtue of being white.
Yes.
That all white people have privilege.
Yes.
You know, is any of that true?
No, it's not true. There's no all in anything, first of all. But, I'll say two things. One thing is I encourage people to read. Reading is so fundamental, and not just reading the things that the critics have to say. Actually read the things that critical race theorists have to say and make your own judgment about whether critical race theory is actually saying the things that the detractors say. All too often, the problem is that the extremists come up with a rap on an idea. And it's not fact-checked. It's not subject to any kind of a critical inquiry. It just gets reported. And then the mainstream media pick up the controversy and just say, this is a controversial idea. Or, this is what the idea is. Do you agree with it or not? Without actually saying, is this really the idea? And I'll add to that once extremists are able to label a group of people in distorted ways, many times that group of people become the subject of the media's interrogation rather than people who actually get to speak for themselves. I can't tell you how many times a story has been done about what critical race theory people think. The critics get to talk, but we don't get to talk. That is an imbalance. That's another asymmetry that produces these distortions that never have the opportunity to really be interrogated. And the last thing I would say is this, and this is what I do a lot of times with large audiences. I will give them scenarios in which it's pretty clear that race is playing a role, but not explicitly. What's an example? In the United States, if you try to get your property evaluated and your property is seen as being racialized, it's Black property, you might get less in the effort to evaluate the property than if you take all your pictures out of the living room, all your textiles out, and you get a white friend to come and get your property assessed. Many times, many times, the property value will suddenly go up. Why is that? So I'll ask people, if you think the answer to that question is it was just a mistake, it was an incorrect placement of a decimal, then sit down. You are not a critical race theorist. But if you know that one of the main ways that Black property in the United States or brown property is undervalued because of the way that markets actually devalue property owned by Black people or property in Black neighborhoods, keep standing, because you're probably a critical race theorist. You don't have to be a lawyer. You don't have to be an advocate. You don't have to be an activist. You just have to be literate about the way that race works in this world to be called a critical race theorist. Now, do you want people to take away your capacity to think critically about what this scenario is telling you? If you want that taken away, or you don't want to help your children or other people understand how race might be working, then okay, you are an opponent to critical race theory. But if you think this is literacy that we need to be able to hold on to identify when race is denying people opportunity, then you're on our side on this debate.
So what do you think is going on now? Because you have this essay, the epilogue at the back of this memoir, which is pretty bleak, to be honest, about why your ideas and the ideas of your colleagues are so under attack.
Well, it's bleak because we've been here before, and one wants to think that lessons from the past are available to help us navigate the future. Unfortunately, the reality in the United States is there's been a constant faction in American society that has preferred to break the nation rather than share it on an equitable basis. That's what the Civil War was about, as it's called, the war between the states, if you're a Southerner, or the war of Northern aggression, if you're really a Southerner, rather than it was a war fought over the right of white slaveholders to hold Black people in perpetuity. It was a war fought over the idea about whether people who were enslavable could ever be citizens of the United States. This was a decision that the Supreme Court made in Dred Scott. So this war was a war that was fought on behalf of those who'd rather break away from the United States than to rethink this question about whether the ownership of other people based on race was ever legitimate in a democracy and whether it should extend indefinitely into the future. This same faction overthrew Reconstruction, which created citizenship for everybody. This same faction denied people the right to vote on the basis of race. So this faction has always been there. It has sometimes been more powerful and other times less powerful. It lost power in the 20th century. It lost power when Brown versus Board of Education was decided that said segregation in public education was unconstitutional. It lost power when the Voting Rights Act was decided. And now it regained power with the Trump administration, both of them, with the idea that America was better before people like me were free, before there were laws that prevented discrimination. And so in this effort to recreate an America before all of these things happened, the strategy is to erase the history of what life was like for most people back then, to erase the rationale for having aggressive civil rights protections, and to erase the function of race consciousness so we can see those areas where the shadows of that past are still casting themselves into this moment and into the future. So yeah, they want to erase the history, the ideas, those of us who are backtalkers, in order to make this a comfortable return to an intolerable past.
And they want to take away the ability to teach or discuss intersectionality, critical race theory,
absolutely,
in education.
And actually, I have to say on that note, I'm not surprised. One of the reasons that chapter is bleak is it's not because of MAGA per se. They're on brand. They're doing what the president has asked them to do, to take us back to the past. My discomfort is with stakeholders of racial justice and gender justice, people who are deeply, deeply distressed about the deterioration of our democracy, yet do not see these efforts to censor what people can read and have access to erase ideas that have embraced the aspirations for a more livable, more equitable future. They have instead believed that it's better to pivot, better to acquiesce, better to comply, sometimes in advance, even though all the evidence shows that anticipatory compliance, which is what Timothy Snyder calls it, does not protect us. It does not protect us as individuals, as institutions, and as a democracy. So I call for backtalking as a way to contest these ideas, not just the ideas from MAGA, but those who think that this is going to pass, like it's a flu. It's not a flu. There's no bottom to this until we create the bottom and start talking back to the descent that we find ourselves in right now.
You have a particularly devastating chapter on your participation in President Obama's project for young black men. Why was he such a disappointment?
Well, I have to modify that. I was and remain proud that Obama occupied the White House. I was and remain proud that our nation was able to overcome some of the limitations in political possibility, which is what his election represents. So that is not a disappointment. The conditions upon which he was felt himself constrained in being the first black president, that is where the disappointment rests. The president was known to say, "I am not the president of just Black America. I'm the president of all America," which of course was true. But it also didn't mean that Black America and other marginalized groups shouldn't have legitimately expected that the president would be able to speak to things that were specifically, historically presented as ongoing obstacles to Black, brown, and other marginalized people. So there was this sense that to be president for everybody meant that our expectations about how he might address the historical disadvantages would be diminished. And that was disappointing. Yet, when Trayvon Martin, who was a young 14-year-old African-American boy, was killed by a vigilante who saw himself as protecting his neighborhood, there was an outcry. I mean, it was palpable. The distress and the feeling that we were back in the 50s when Emmett Till, another 14-year-old, was lynched basically by white vigilantes. So there was really a demand, an expectation, a hope that late in his second term, he would begin to address some of the ways that the structures in which Black people lived, brown people lived, needed to be addressed. So when Trayvon Martin was killed and President Obama did indicate he was going to say something about it, do something about it, there was hope. I was hopeful. What he ended up doing was effectively saying that, this case is over. The justice system did what the justice system was, set out to do. So that was, first of all, deeply disappointing to me and many of us who had been very critical of the criminal justice system. There's this saying that we went to the courthouse and all we saw was just us, not just justice. And so that seemed to be playing out in that moment. But he pivoted away from that and pivoted away from other structural things that were happening that contributed to Black boys and Black girls being left behind, the defunding of public education, the erosion of civil rights protections, the increasing isolation of low-income people of color. All of these were structured dimensions of disadvantage, and none of these things were things that he felt comfortable addressing.
I mean, wasn't the risk, I suppose, that had he said what you wanted him to say as America's first Black president, he may have incited nationwide riots?
I doubt that there was a risk of rioting. There was
if he'd have said the system is stacked against you,
yes,
it was never going to deliver justice, Why wouldn't people have risen up?
So people don't rise up when people acknowledge the inequality. The rising up usually comes when the system says, this is what it is, this is all it is, deal with it. Those have been the moments when riots have happened. To go back to the question you asked earlier about Martin Luther King, there weren't riots when Black folks tried to march to Selma in order to agitate for civil rights. At least there weren't riots from Black folks. There were riots from the police who tried to beat Black people into submission. The riots, when they came when Martin Luther King was assassinated, when all hope of substantially changing, when even the acknowledgement or the recognition that there was an injustice was suffocated, which was wiped out. So the acknowledgement of injustice has never been the moment or the spark that created unrest. It was the repression of those who were peacefully trying to create change. So I don't think the real risk was right. I think the real risk, and this was one of the things that I think held a lot of people's tongue during the first administration. The risk was he would lose support among many white voters who believed him to be the post-racial president, and they thought post-racial meant all this race stuff is behind us. We don't have to think about it anymore. We don't have to talk about it anymore. Heck, we don't need these laws anymore because, we've hit the bell. It's over. And a lot of Black folks knew that that wasn't true, but thought as though, okay, maybe we're going to have to act as if, or hope that on the side or in incremental ways, there would be some acknowledgement of the ongoing dimension of racial inequality. But now we're talking about the second term. We're not talking about, an impending election. We're talking about the final years of the second term. And we're talking about some things that were happening that were clearly, racist things. So to not be able to address that and to instead frame it as these racial problems are the product of boys not having mentors or boys not having father figures. And we can address that with internships or little clubs. It was problematic both because the problem was not the absence of fathers. In fact, the data show that Black fathers are actually more involved in their children's lives than other fathers. So it was just a myth. But the second thing is it was a myth that led to the exclusion of girls and women. And because they were excluded, it was easier to deny that there were structural dimensions to racial inequality and instead focus on behavioral or cultural dimensions. And that goes all the way back to, unfortunately, the 60s. So that's one of the reasons why we had to say something. We can't go backwards in order to move forward.
Just finally, clearly what you've laid out are structural challenges which require structural answers. But for individuals, I guess what you're saying is what you can do is talk back.
Well, absolutely. You can resist the requirement that you act as if the world is different from what you know it to be. You can resist those who try to infantilize you. You can resist those who tell you that your history is insignificant, your story is irrelevant, your aspirations are unrealizable. That's just minimalist backtalking for your own interests. And if we do it collectively, it turns out that there is a critical mass to fight back. Right now, the question is this a war that can be won? The one thing that we know for sure is if we're not showing up on the battlefield, it can't be won. And so our only choice is to show up, bend that arc of the moral universe towards justice. It takes hands to do it. It's not going to do it on its own.
Kimberlé Crenshaw, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
You can watch all of these interviews on the Channel 4 News YouTube channel. Until next time, bye-bye.